Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
In asking what universities are for, I'm trying to ask that we should get away from seeing them simply as directly vocational training agencies or applied technology industrial labs, and ask what it is that universities distinctively have done, and therefore what kind of arrangements we need to make to have them flourish in our own time. And one way to begin to think about universities differently, I think, and to try to identify their distinctiveness, is to say that they provide a partly protected space within which trying to extend and deepen human understanding has priority over any other immediate purposes in a way that would be, well, perhaps madness, or at least very disruptive for most other types of institutions in society even to countenance. This pattern also, I think, helps us identify something which distinguishes universities from bodies with which, in some respects, they have some kinship, such as the research and development laboratories of large corporations or the various political and pressure group think tanks. Because institutions of these latter kinds obviously pursue inquiry into a variety of topics and of a high quality of inquiry quite often, but usually for some practical purpose defined by the interests of the sponsoring organization itself. And they're not, by and large, interested in what we might call the second-order inquiries, the inquiries into the boundaries of the topic, the status of the language that's employed for it, the character of the knowledge that they produce, and so on. And perhaps one mark of an academic discipline is that such second-order inquiries can never be deemed illegitimate or irrelevant in advance. So when reflection is free to pursue these, then again it starts to develop an intellectual logic of its own. Among the public at large, there is, I think, a strong recognition, potentially, that this kind of intellectual inquiry is central to universities, and therefore that there's much more sometimes latent appreciation of the value of this kind of work than the current rather narrow official discourse about economic growth ever really succeeds in tapping into. And I think people are not principally hoping that universities in these sorts of cases are exclusively devoting themselves to increasing the GDP, but that they're devoting themselves to finding new ways to increase human understanding, and that will, in the long run, have a variety of beneficial effects. It has to be emphasized, I think, that higher education is a public good and not simply a good for those who happen to get the private benefit from it at any given moment. And therefore, I think it's a mistake to allow the case for universities to be represented as a sectional interest merely on the part of those who happen to be current students or currently employed there. The government, of course, says that in the new scheme of fees, they will be continuing to provide large sums of money by supporting the loans that go to students, and they're routing the money that way rather than in grants to the universities themselves. Now, one way to start to think about this would be to say, I wonder if there were no more public subsidy to institutions such as the British Museum or through the license fee to the BBC, and that instead the government were to loan any citizen who wanted to use those services a sum equivalent to the charges that those institutions would then be required to make for their services, would that in public perception start to mark a change in status of these institutions, and especially perhaps if those vouchers could also be spent in alternative venues run entirely for profit? Now, one of the consequences at the moment, I would say, of the perceived public status has been this sense of public entitlement and belief that admission to university should be matter of intellectual aptitude only. Now, it's very hard to tell at this stage, I think, and Paul will be able to talk, I think, more authoritatively on what sorts of changes may come in the wake of the new fee arrangements. Of course, they claim in the white paper that these will put students at the heart of the system. I think that's unpersuasive for all kinds of reasons, including that they're at the heart of the system already. It'd be more accurate, it seems to me, to say that it tries to put the price mechanism at the heart of the system. That's to say that a university place will partly depend, if all this comes to the fruition that is desired for it in the government publications, it will partly then become a transaction between buyer and seller, and that this may be what will indicate a major shift in public perception from being a public to being a private system, even although the government will continue to underwrite the loan system. Just suppose for a moment that graduates were going to be asked instead to make retrospective payments to a national higher education fund rather than to pay fees up front to a particular university. It could involve the same amount of money as they will contribute under the new system. It could involve calibrating repayments in relation to earnings in the same way the new system will do. But it would represent a different principle, wouldn't it? Graduates would contribute to the maintenance of the national higher education system and not pay for a product from an individual service provider. And I'd have to say that most universities, or many universities at least, might reject the model that I just sketched there because they would fear they would have less control over this income directly in the future than they will under the fee system. And of course the so-called top universities may believe that they have much more to gain from the new fee system anyway, which generally, like all market systems, tends to advantage the already advantaged. But the key difference, surely, and this is from the other end of the telescope, the key difference as far as the government is concerned as well, would be that my imagined scheme would not subject universities to the same kind of notional market discipline as does dependence by each individual institution on fees paid directly to them by individual students. And that, I think, is one key aspect of this dividing line in public perception between the public and private nature of these institutions. Contributing to national economic prosperity is not a straightforward goal, and we need to ask a lot of questions about it, including questions like how much prosperity we need and who, in these cases, we are, and is it desirable at any cost, and what, in its turn, is it good for, and so on. And I think any serious attempt to address these questions will inevitably involve some appeal to non-economic values. If the language we use to talk about universities represents them as being principally institutions that provide vocational training for employment and the application of technology to promoting economic growth, and if the language we use about students represents them as being consumers who shop in the educational supermarket purely for what provides the most remunerative future job at the lowest possible cost, then those are the kinds of universities we shall end up with. And therefore, I think it's very important to try to articulate a different and more adequate conception of what universities are for, because otherwise we risk damaging and, in some cases, perhaps even destroying some of the defining characteristics of universities that make them so valuable to our society.
It looks like there's going to be an undiminished appetite and demand for higher education, not just from people who live in the UK, but people who live around the world, but who dream of coming to the UK to study. There is going to be some sort of short-term demographic fall-off in school leavers in the next few years, but longer term, I think it looks pretty clear that that demand seems to grow, and I think that demand will be very hard for any government to hold back. And this is why the current government is worried about the genie it has let out of the bottle. You know, on the one hand, people in government want a market in higher education, and on the other hand, they're terrified that costs are going to get out of control, and the new system will become very quickly just as unsustainable as the old system. And that's why we see in this first year of the operation of the new system, coming this September, there will be over 20,000 less students going to universities in this country than there were the year before. And that's not a great start to a great new system. Any parent who cares for their child wants them to go to university because the benefits, are so evident, giving graduates greater opportunities, greater confidence and skill, and a greater capacity for developing interesting and rewarding careers. But on the other hand, lots of people tell me, oh, too many people go to university. A lot of people, all these Mickey Mouse subjects, and they study things they shouldn't, and they don't deserve to be there for some reason or other that I never quite understand. And I usually say two things to those people. One is that the UK lags quite a long way behind some of the most successful economies in the world when it comes to participation of young people in higher education. And to reduce it even further in the financial climate that we're in, at a time when most people in this country are more likely to earn a living from their heads rather than their hands, reducing that doesn't really seem to be a very sensible strategy for any sort of growth. And the second thing I say is I'm really much less worried about whether or not there are, some people who go to university who shouldn't. I'm frankly much more worried about what I think are thousands of people who are currently excluded from higher education just because they don't get the chance. Young people, especially young men from lower socioeconomic groups, from black and minority ethnic groups, are still really quite significantly underrepresented in our universities, and I refuse to believe that that's because they're not clever enough or they don't have sufficient aspiration. And the big challenge for us is one that hasn't gone away. It's how to support and encourage and inspire those young people to develop their potential and aim for university. I'm chair of the Universities UK Longer Term Strategy Network. Now, as a group, we're not in the business of trying to make predictions or forecasts, because they're always going to be wide of the mark. But what we do is try and identify some of the key drivers of change, try to understand them, try and explore some of the more likely scenarios to help us perhaps prepare for the future, perhaps prepare ourselves to adapt to what may be coming around the corner, perhaps if we're lucky, even try to influence events more than we might otherwise have been able to do. So that's what we try to do. And although we don't make predictions, one area where I think we're already seeing signs of significant change is that there's going to be a really quite radical shift in the variety and the complexity of higher education provision, which is going to be on offer to future students. I think we're going to see different types of provision, different types of providers, together with the explosion of the open education resources on the internet. And if you've not been to the MITx website, I encourage you to do so. There's a vision of what the future may hold for us. All of that, I think, means new types of organizations will pop up. Many of them may not look anything like a traditional university, yet they could have a very significant impact on the way higher education can be experienced by lots of people. Same qualification we can see. It's going to be accessed from a number of different routes with very different pedagogies. And what does this mean for our universities, all this fluidity, all this multiplicity of provision on a global scale? I think a number of things come together. We have a really strong reputation for our universities in this country. There's a pretty widespread culture of innovation in those universities, and they have the institutional autonomy to set their own strategic direction. But it's also going to bring some challenges. I think the potential for confusion among students as things get more complex, more varied, will grow. So, making sure that they get good quality, impartial advice becomes more important than ever, and making sure that public confidence is maintained in the quality of a UK degree, I think, is absolutely central. But there are also risks for institutions. Either they become overwhelmed by all this change, or they get marginalized for some reason, or maybe they embrace it with such enthusiasm that they lose their moorings and forget that they were institutions set up to serve the public good with an historic role at the heart of intellectual, social, and economic advancement. And I think at that point, the question that universities need to keep asking themselves is not what are we for so much, is what does a very complex, a very fast change of society need from us? Of course, if you say, what does society need from its universities, answering that is very difficult. And what it needs may be different to what it says it needs. But I think seeking to align the interests of a university with the interests of both the community it serves and of the individual students it's there to educate is the ongoing project for any university with a mission to serve the public good. And that means that universities have to take on all sorts of responsibilities and duties that compete with each other. So, on one hand, they have to provide the environment that gives each generation of young people, the inspiration, the encouragement, the help to develop inquiring minds, to become critically aware, lead more rewarding, more responsible lives. And of course, they play a huge role in driving intellectual, social, and economic advancement, not least by generating new knowledge, new ideas, new technologies, new ways of understanding, even new government policy. So trying to do all those things all at once, I think that's, for me, what makes a university. It's also what makes a university such a complex organization, such an exciting place to be in, and it's also what makes them so important.